And so I wanted to start with a question of what does the photography of the future look like to you?
The photography of the future, we already know it belongs to everybody. It's not the domain of only people who have cameras or think of themselves as photographers. So then that begs the question, who is the photographer of the future? Does that category even exist? And for me, it stopped existing a while ago because I started to think that I'm much more an archivist. And again, during the pandemic is when I realized how deep my archive was. So, you know, all photographers who like me have worked 40 years, all of us who worked for 40 years, 50 years, will have incredible archives. But somehow, I found in my archive that instead of going vast and wide across the globe, across all the kinds of situations I could get access to that I could photograph, my archive went deeper. Like if I could ask you to imagine different wells, whether it was cities or people, and then somehow I couldn't let go of them. And so now I have an archive where there are people I have photographed from the time they were born till they are now 42, or places that I've gone back to again and again. So my archive is, I have to find a word for it, but right now I'm calling it just all these wells. And at the bottom of those wells is water. It's the same water that's nurturing all those wells. So therefore, when I go into my archive, I find, of course, the same people that I've photographed over 30 years, 40 years, but also these incredible connections because I didn't go very far. So that's another kind of archive that's also valuable. But I would say, if I think of myself now and what the value of what I do may be, I think it is the archivist that I have been. So I start to feel that if I could somehow put that seed into younger photographers so that from now they start to think of how they are going to build their archives and not leave it to chance and accident, to think of what are some areas that they could imagine photographing for the rest of their lives. And just go deeper and deeper into, because there is no other medium that can record time like photography. And there is something to the personality of the photographer, the doggedness of the photographer, as we knew the photographer, that goes after something day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And so if we start to think of those as these archives that we build, alongside everything else we want to do with photography, I think we have the possibility of building something really, really valuable with all the images that exist in the world. I think there's a certain kind of, like an archivist is a certain kind of personality. And the photographer is a certain kind of personality, the traditional photographer, the photographer of the past. So how do we take that into the future? And I see that as this building these deep archives and knowing that somewhere at the bottom is the same water that's feeding all of them. And then that is a tremendous strength. And that's what I can't say this will happen, so I can't say what the future of photography or photographers will be, but that is one kind of photographer that I'm really looking for. And I was very, very happy to meet the 830 Collective, because there are 9 photographers working in different parts of the country. So they then have this incredible opportunity to build a collective archive. So we're not talking about a day in the life of Goa kind of project. It's not once a year. It's year after year, decade after decade, till they go. So I don't know if photography has ever had that kind of a collective archive over decades. So I'm really, really excited to meet this collective, because I think the kind of archive they might be able to create in, whatever, 20 years, 40 years. I may not be around to see it, but it'll really be something very valuable. And I just would like to digress a little bit here. I'm particularly moved today because I have seen this exhibition, Growing Like a Tree, which Saurabh Hura, who is here, curated in Dubai first, in 2 iterations, and this is the 3rd iteration. And in that exhibition, for the first time, I saw tremendous generosity in photography, tremendous support for other artists. You know, it wasn't about Saurabh himself, not at all in fact. All the work went into creating different works with different photographers. And if I might say that, politically incorrect as it may be, I think the idea of the 830 collective somewhere gets connected to Growing Like a Tree. And it's wonderful that Growing Like a Tree and 830 is being seen at the same time. There's a much deeper connection, which in time you will realize. But I think a lot of it is because of Saurabh and his tremendous generosity. And it's embarrassing for him to hear that, but I can't help saying it. And I would have said it even if he wasn't here.
So then would you say that, you know, this idea of photography being a solitary profession, or a solitary practice rather, not so much a profession, is that sort of, would it be, it's something more, right? So would we say that photography is really solitary in that aspect?
Well, I say photography is friendship. So for me, photography has really been a way of connecting with people, and you know, 40 years, 50 years, who knows how long I live, it will be 60 years. So for me, it has been solitary, if I can be absolutely frank, within the profession. Because we didn't have this growing like a tree kind of generosity. So in the profession, I think there was a lot of isolation. And it worked very well. It worked to my advantage because I went out and did whatever I wanted to do with photography, and I didn't become part of a club as photography is prone to be. But I think with Growing Like a Tree, with the 830 collective, something different is going to emerge in photography, because we've not had this kind of, what should I call it? Well, collective photography. But not just for a cause, not just for a commission. You know, it's not like Aperture saying a day in the life of India. It's 9 photographers coming together and saying, we are going to work on this for the rest of our lives. And that's what it takes, I think, to be a photo archivist, is to find things that you care about enough that you can sustain for the rest of your life. And of course they will change, but at least to have those obsessions. And then, you know, it's not even a question of the quality of photographs. It's really that someone made those photographs. It doesn't matter whether those pictures that I made of Mona or Zakir are sharp, strong photos, not strong photos. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I made those pictures in Zakir 1981. So that's the important thing. It's that the musicians that I photographed with them, that's the great archive. And all of this came out in COVID. And had I known this when I was younger, obviously I would have photographed a lot more. And so therefore, it's the thought I would like to put out to all photographers, especially the younger ones, and see if that's something they want to fly with.
Okay, but I wanted to ask the final question about, you've talked about building the archive and that it is something that we do over time, but then the archive is also something that needs to be sustained with a certain kind of quality, and a certain kind of interest and a certain engagement, not just with photographing the same thing for 40 years, but also things around it, understanding it. So what is it to actually sustain an archive beyond just documenting specifics?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked, but for me, photography and literature and writing and that kind of inquiry is a given. Research is a given, but maybe I should clarify that. So how do you sustain that for the rest of your life? You have to find something that is close to you. There's not much point saying I want to photograph something in the Andamans for the rest of my life. You know, that's a fait accompli and it's not going to happen. So you have to find something close to you, something you're curious about that maybe you don't completely understand and you want to understand it through photographing. But photographing is one part of it. There has to be solid research sustaining the interest that you want to bring to the archive or the focus you want for your archive. So there has to be tremendous amount of literature being read around that subject. If you find that there's something about the color red that interests you, then you have to read Pamuk's My Name is Red. You know, it's no good to say I don't like reading, which I get from a lot of photographers. I think there's a real problem there, and there's something about photography that slightly is not so encouraging of literature. But I think reading is going to give you the experience that you will bring to the work, will give you the questions that you will bring to the work, the challenges that you will bring to the work. So if you decide you want to photograph, I don't know, feet for the rest of your life because that's your thing, you know, you study the orthopedic side of it, you study the romantic side of it, you study the sensual side of it, you see all kinds of poetry around it. So for me, any way to photograph something is like looking at everything around it. It's never just photography. So certainly the archive can only be built if you're going to put in that kind of rigor as well. It's not, you know, because if it's just about photographing what's happening outside the Sunaparanta gate, you don't need a photographer, you just put a sensor there like people do with wildlife, and each time someone passes by, a photo is taken. So you can work those systems out, and with AI, who knows what happens. But it's really about the rigor of thought that you will put into the photography that will make the archive richer and deeper, but also with lots and lots of roots. And that's why I also like the title of Growing Like a Tree. I always say it's growing like a tree that'll grow into a forest. And so when I see you all here in the same space, it's quite moving for me because it means that forest is happening, you know? It's not going to be isolated photographers working in an isolated way. So that's wonderful to see here at Sunaparanta, you and Growing Like a Tree together.